This is how Western powers are keeping Africa poor. The involvement of Western powers in African affairs has a long and complicated history, with both positive and negative impacts on the continent. While there have been many instances where Western aid and assistance has helped to promote development and stability in Africa, there are also many ways in which the policies and actions of Western countries have contributed to poverty and inequality on the continent. From colonialism to neocolonialism, the legacy of Western involvement in Africa has left a profound impact on the continent. While many African countries have gained independence from their former colonial powers, the legacies of exploitation, resource extraction, and political domination continue to shape African politics and economies. Today, African countries continue to face a range of challenges, including poverty, conflict, corruption, and poor governance. While these issues are complex and multifaceted, it is clear that the policies and actions of Western countries have played a role in perpetuating poverty and inequality in Africa. This video will explore some of the ways in which Western involvement in African affairs is making Africa remain poor, and will examine potential solutions to address these issues. 1. Exploitation of Africa's valuable natural resources. The exploitation of Africa's valuable natural resources by Western powers has been a significant factor in perpetuating poverty on the continent. Western countries have historically extracted resources such as oil, gas, minerals, and timber from Africa, often with little regard for the social and environmental impacts of their activities. This has resulted in significant revenue loss for African countries, as most of the profits from resource extraction are captured by foreign companies, leaving little revenue for African governments to invest in social services and economic development. Furthermore, the extraction of natural resources can also lead to environmental degradation and the displacement of local communities, who may rely on natural resources for their livelihoods. This can contribute to poverty and exacerbate existing inequalities. In addition, the exploitation of natural resources can contribute to political instability and conflict, as the struggle for control over resources has often led to armed conflict and violence in many African countries. 2. Foreign aid from the West. Foreign aid from the West has been a double-edged sword for Africa. While aid can provide much-needed resources to help address poverty in Africa, it has also contributed to some negative consequences that have perpetuated poverty in the continent. One way in which foreign aid from the West has contributed to poverty in Africa is through dependency. Many African countries have become heavily dependent on aid from Western countries and international organizations, which can lead to a situation where aid becomes a substitute for domestic resource mobilization and economic development. This can create a cycle of dependency, where African countries are reliant on aid to maintain basic services and avoid economic collapse, rather than developing their own sustainable economies. Another way in which foreign aid from the West has contributed to poverty in Africa is through the imposition of conditions. Many Western countries and international organizations attach conditions to aid, which require African countries to implement specific policies or reforms in exchange for aid. Some of these conditions, such as those attached to structural adjustment programs, have been criticized for their negative impacts on social services and economic development in African countries. Moreover, aid can also create incentives for corruption. In some cases, aid money has been siphoned off by corrupt officials or used to prop up authoritarian regimes, rather than being used for its intended purpose. This can undermine efforts to promote good governance and reduce poverty in Africa. Finally, aid can also have negative impacts on local markets and industries. In some cases, aid can lead to a situation where local producers and businesses are unable to compete with subsidized foreign goods, which can lead to the decline of local industries and exacerbate poverty. 3. Debts and foreign loans from Western powers. Debt and foreign loans from Western powers have been a significant contributor to poverty in Africa. Most Western power force Africa countries to accept loans, and African leaders who decline some of these loans are sometimes assassinated. Many African countries have accumulated significant amounts of debt as a result of loans from Western countries and international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. One of the main ways in which debt has contributed to poverty in Africa is through debt servicing. Many African countries spend a significant portion of their national budgets on servicing debt, which can limit their ability to invest in social services and economic development. This can perpetuate poverty and exacerbate existing inequalities. In addition, the conditions attached to loans and debt relief programs can have negative impacts on social services and economic development in African countries. For example, structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank often require African countries to implement austerity measures and privatize public services, which can further limit their ability to invest in social services and economic development. Furthermore, debt can also create incentives for corruption and mismanagement. In some cases, loan money has been siphoned off by corrupt officials or used to prop up authoritarian regimes, rather than being used for its intended purpose. This can undermine efforts to promote good governance and reduce poverty in Africa. 4. Monopoly buying structures by Western powers. Western powers have often used monopoly buying structures to keep Africa in poverty. Monopoly buying refers to a situation where a single buyer controls the market for a particular commodity, which gives them significant bargaining power over suppliers. In many cases, Western companies have used their position as monopoly buyers to set prices that are disadvantageous to African producers. For example, in the cocoa industry, a handful of multinational corporations control the majority of the market, which gives them significant power to set prices for cocoa beans. This can lead to a situation where African cocoa farmers receive a small fraction of the final sale price for their produce, which can perpetuate poverty and exacerbate existing inequalities. Moreover, the concentration of power in the hands of a few multinational corporations can also limit opportunities for African producers to access global markets. For example, in the coffee industry, a few multinational corporations control the market, which can make it difficult for African coffee farmers to compete and gain access to global markets. 5. Food dependency from Western powers. The West has historically encouraged African countries to produce cash crops such as coffee, cocoa, and tea for export, rather than food crops. This has had negative impacts on food security and contributed to poverty in the continent. One of the main ways in which the promotion of cash crops has contributed to poverty in Africa is through the displacement of food crops. Many small-scale farmers have been incentivized to switch from growing food crops to growing cash crops for export, which can lead to a situation where local food systems are disrupted and food security is undermined. This can perpetuate poverty and exacerbate existing inequalities. Furthermore, the promotion of cash crops can also create vulnerabilities in the food system. African countries that rely heavily on cash crops for export are vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices and the impacts of climate change. This can lead to a situation where African countries are unable to meet their basic food needs and are forced to rely on food imports, which can exacerbate poverty and undermine local food systems. Moreover, the promotion of cash crops has also been linked to environmental degradation and the displacement of local communities. Large-scale monoculture production of cash crops has led to deforestation, soil degradation, and water scarcity in some regions, which can undermine local livelihoods and exacerbate poverty. 6. Support of authoritarian regimes by Western powers. The support of authoritarian regimes by Western powers has contributed to poverty in Africa in a number of ways. Firstly, authoritarian regimes tend to be characterized by corruption, mismanagement, and a lack of transparency, which can undermine economic development efforts and contribute to poverty. This is because such regimes often prioritize the interests of a small elite over the needs of the broader population, and engage in practices such as embezzlement and cronyism that divert resources away from productive investments. Secondly, the support for authoritarian regimes has also contributed to political instability and conflict in many African countries, which can undermine social and economic development efforts and exacerbate poverty. This is because such regimes often rely on repression and coercion to maintain power, which can lead to popular discontent and resistance. Thirdly, the repression of civil society organizations, NGOs, and other groups by authoritarian regimes can limit opportunities for poverty reduction efforts. These groups often play important roles in promoting human rights, advocating for marginalized communities, and providing social services, and their suppression can leave vulnerable populations without access to critical resources. Overall, the support for authoritarian regimes in Africa has had negative impacts on economic development, political stability, and human rights, which have contributed to poverty in the continent. Addressing the issue of poverty in Africa will require a comprehensive approach that takes into account the complex and multifaceted nature of the issue. This may include promoting good governance, reducing corruption, supporting democratic institutions, and promoting economic policies that support sustainable development and reduce poverty in the continent. How Africa can stop Western influence? There are several steps that African countries can take to reduce the influence of Western powers on the continent. 1. Promote self-reliance. African countries can promote self-reliance by investing in local industries, promoting local ownership of resources, and reducing dependence on foreign aid and loans. 2. Strengthen regional cooperation. African countries can work together to strengthen regional cooperation, promote trade, and build political and economic alliances that can help to reduce the influence of outside powers. 3. Promote good governance. African countries can promote good governance by reducing corruption, promoting transparency, and strengthening democratic institutions. This can help to build stronger, more accountable states that are less susceptible to outside influence. 4. Diversify partnerships. African countries can diversify their partnerships by building relationships with a broader range of countries, including emerging economies in Asia and Latin America. 5. Invest in education and innovation. African countries can invest in education and innovation to build a skilled workforce and promote the development of new industries that can drive economic growth and reduce dependence on foreign powers. Overall, reducing the influence of Western powers on the continent will require a comprehensive approach that takes into account the complex and multifaceted nature of the issue. This will require sustained investment and cooperation from all stakeholders, including African governments, international organizations, and local communities. Thanks for watching this video and subscribe to the channel for more.